So recognizing the Armenian genocide is going to be the step forward, because it's going to cause a trigger effect. So be patient with me as I go through some important information. So understanding that Thule society was the early precursor for Nazi ideology. And what I'm going to show you is a complex, provocative web of relationships within the esoteric world, which is the world of lesser-known knowledge. Lesser-known groups and organizations and individuals and ideologies. It's actually like an undercurrent in which is a revolving door, where things can be done in the secret behind the curtain. Because behind that revolving door are more curtains and more revolving doors. Thule Society was founded in Munich in 1918, or really 1917, as people were already in their meeting. It was a cultist, Voltisch, which is people group referring to Germanic culture. So, not going too much into Thule as Germanic mysticism, but instead focusing it as being an anti-communist organization, because that was the uniting principle at the time. Understanding that Thule was circulating Bolshevik as a slur word, and that Bolshevik was used as a slur word during the Armenian genocide, even before the Bolsheviks took power. Because there was, in a certain degree, a Red Scare that was happening even before the Bolsheviks took power. As we know of the Great Palmer Raids that happened in the United States. When, in 1918, so after the Bolsheviks took power, but there was a build-up towards it. Different things were happening. Grievances, workers were rioting in the streets. It wasn't a time of abundance. There was massive poverty during this time. Colonialism was very ripe, so overseas empires, France, England, they all controlled giant territories overseas. The crown jewel of India was the envy of Germany in many ways, and Russia obviously was competing in the great game against England. But seeing the Theosophical Society as being anti-English, anti-Christian, and anti-communist was the major fall that happened in the 20th century. The rise of the Theosophical Enlightenment meant Hollywood. It meant that people were that free. And so this culture of freedom, and not viewing it as hedonistic, don't jump to that extreme, but seeing it as true intellectually free. You can travel spiritually from one religion to another. So this freedom was aligned in many ways, giving rise to such groups like the Young Turks, who had their revolution. But then later, they became corrupted. So when they had the revolution in the early 1900s, 1908, and so it was a short-lived freedom, and Masonic lodges were supporting the Young Turks, and it was a pluralistic vision of many people being free. But it's short-lived. So seeing the short-lived, it's the same story that happened with the revolution in France, 1789, the French Revolution. The short-lived freedom gives rise to dictatorship. So the Young Turks were involved in the Armenian genocide. That is disturbing when you actually learn the history and you're really shocked. You're like, they have an actual show today that's actually for liberal news, named after the young Turks who committed the Armenian Genocide. It's a sad story. So give me a second to look at my notes here, because I know I'm going on a lot of tangents, but that's my style. So I'm going to begin with the question of occult Orientalism and imperial esotericism, theosophy in the late Ottoman intellectual sphere. So that sounds like the PhD of a lifetime. Because everyone knows the Ottoman world, there was lots of secret societies. Everyone was wearing those hats with the little tassel. And even today, we still have that tassel used in so many graduation ceremonies because it was so important to intellectual development. The Ottoman Empire was a place for intellectual and historic cultivation. That's why the esoteric world was so rich in the Ottoman Empire, and like the establishment of the Shriners today have that tassel. So the historical and intellectual context that I just showed, it was in major cities like Beirut and Alexandria. So Samarna, different cities were really important to spreading the sponsorship and cultural development of the theosophical and theosophically aligned lodges. There was an overlap. So it was pluralistic, and that lodges have a lot of freedom, and that individuals' endeavors are private for their own individual undertaking. Which means that when you enter the secret society where you're free, So seeing that like when you enter Freemasonry you're not beholden to it, you do swear an oath, but you are not beholden to it in the sense that it is a structure that now you're a prisoner to it, because they view themselves as being more free when they're part of it. It's an interesting way of viewing it. So theosophy and nationalism is very important. And so many separate videos can be made for each country, because what happens is that when theosophy develops within a nation, it sponsors that nation and allows for nationalism to develop. And that was the history of decolonization. And they're not teaching it properly in the universities, because they want to paint it all about white versus black. All about the color of the skin, and not about actually what happened in history, because the theosophical lodges would empower people regardless of the color of their skin. In many ways, people of color benefited from theosophy as the stepping stone for their liberation, for decolonization. So theosophy and Armenians. Armenian intellectuals, particularly in Smyrna, Constantinople, and Egypt, were among the most active in engaging with Western esotericism. Some Armenian Masons and intellectuals embraced theosophical ideas, especially in the form of spiritual universalism, humanism, and anti-clerical reform, calling for humanitarian causes and for intellectual development. However, official Ottoman attitudes towards Armenians, particularly after the Hamidian massacres between 1894 to 1896, and during the Armenian Genocide of 1915, created an environment of repression and suspicion, which stifled many cultural esoteric networks. So, the stifling would cause the society to become more stiff. The theosophical and Masonic lodges allowed for the society to be more open in the short term, but in the long term, they end up getting accused of causing the authoritarianism that ends up developing. So, You see, it's a story of a full circle, and it's a pattern that gets repeated time and time again. Excuse me. The Theosophical and Masonic lodges were later accused of being Armenian fronts, even though those were the systems that put in power the accusers in the beginning. So the perpetrators, in many ways, caused themselves to become victims to their own demise. So due to that suspicion of conspiratorial activity, the lodges were treated with suspicions if they harbored Armenians, Jews, or Greeks, and therefore they were only viewed as politically subversive in that regard. So seeing that the decline and legacy of the free society, secret society world is a story of the Armenian genocide developing. And so Thule represents a new threshold beginning as that old current comes to an end. Because Thule happened in 1917, 1918, and then those older societies get closed in. So the Armenian genocide was very destructive to certain societies, and of course World War I was very destructive to the secret society's world. Public connection to the monarchies, because the monarchies, whether it's the Hohenzollern, the Habsburg, the Ottomans, they lost a lot of their legitimacy in World War I by losing. Important to know that Queen Victoria's 3 grandsons were all kings. So World War I was viewed in many ways as a family dispute. So let me get back to my notes here. Continuing on with the tangent, sorry. Recovering from a sore throat. So, moving on and showing in what places that Armenians were being accused of socialism and communism is very important. Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire and early Republican Turkey were often accused of socialism and communism in a variety of locations and political contexts, particularly in the 1890s through the 1920s. These accusations were used both as ideological charges and as pretexts for surveillance, repression, or outright violence. Below is a breakdown of where and why Armenians were associated with socialism or communism, often regardless of their actual political positions. Constantinople, Istanbul. Context as the imperial capital. Constantinople had a large and vibrant Armenian population, including a significant intelligentsia and a press scene with connections to European leftist and revolutionary circles. Accusations circulated by the Free Turks. Armenian newspapers and cultural organizations were accused of harboring revolutionary tendencies, especially during the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II. So, after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, the reopening of political space allowed Armenian socialist parties like the Social Democrat Hukhakian Party and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnaks, to operate more openly, drawing attention from both Ottoman and foreign observers. These groups were often conflated with Bolshevism after 1917, despite their ideological differences. Eastern Anatolia, Van, Erzurum, Bitelis, Harput. The context in which the development of these accusations is that the Armenian populations were hotbeds of their own nationalist and revolutionary activity, particularly after the Mohammedanian massacres, 1894 to 1896. It's understandable that the Armenians would want to cultivate nationalism and revolutionary activities because they were subjected to persecution. The development of the accusations of socialism and communism was part of counter-revolutionary cells aiming to establish an Armenian genocide that was counter to the establishment of an independent Armenia. Of course, there were communist groups that wanted their own independent Armenia, but the accusation was turned into something more hostile than it had to be. The Russian border was nearby, and many Armenians had family or ideological ties to Russian Armenians, who were part of the Bolshevik or Menshevik parties and aligned with the Bolshevik Revolution. Understandable to a certain degree, given that Russia was in a war that did impact the poor at the time, and the popularity of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks was tied to worker grievances. Understandable that people barely had any freedom during this time period. So during World War I, the Ottoman state accused the Armenian population in these regions of collaborating with the Russian army and fomenting a Bolshevik uprising, charges that were central to the justification of the 1915 deportations and genocide. So even before the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, even before Kerensky, who was part of the provisional government and was a Freemason, even before he took power, so even before the cadets had power, there was this false tendency to associate Armenians with Bolshevism, even though some Armenians were obviously connected to Bolshevism, because Bolshevism was tied to worker class movement in Russia, and Armenians had family ties to certain people in Russia. So these were conflated accusations. So, interesting to note, so Kerensky was a Russian lawyer and the revolutionary who led the Russian provisional government and short-lived Russian Republic for 3 months, from late July to early November 1917. So obviously he was not a Bolshevik. So the thing to note about Kerensky is that if he had more authority and power, then there could have been more stability in Russia, because he supported the Constituent Assembly and elections. So it's really sad. I think Kerensky could have been more promising. So he was a member of the Trudoviks. So that was a separate party, because there was many parties, as I mentioned: Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Trudoviks, socialist revolutionaries. It was very popular amongst the peasantry. The Trudoviks was a breakaway from the Socialist Revolutionary Party faction. So early on, 1905, when you had the revolution in Russia, where the Tsar agreed to establish a Duma. That was the same time that Russia was at war with Japan, and Russia lost that war to Japan. So then Japan had control over Manchuria and Harpen. So then you see that Imperial Japan began to develop. but the thawing between Russian and Japan relations happening with the Black Dragon Society. Important to know. So, Kerensky, he would have given more hope, but this is the reality that didn't happen. And so I was just mourning that loss of that, of what could have been. There could have been more to Russia. There couldn't have to be the Bolsheviks taking power. Because the Bolsheviks took power by force. And so there was the fear of the Bolsheviks, but they were accusing the Bolsheviks of being dangerous before they were actually dangerous. That's where it's like a lot of the history got lost. Because Bolshevik should be held to account for the crimes that they did, but they were being accused of things before they were dangerous. And that's what I think is where a lot of the history got lost, and that's why I'm showing the complexity in this talk, is shining more light on the Armenian genocide, which was a horrific crime against humanity. That's why it is of relevance today to talk about it. So, moving on, I want to show specifically the connection between the Armenian genocide and the political information that is relevant to Red Scares in the Ottoman Empire, as paving the way for the secret society world to support an anti-communist coup, causing an authoritarian genocidal state, then eventually wants to persecute those secret societies because it wants to shut down a free society. So it's the story of the serpent eating its own tail, is what we should call it. So just as there was a Jewish question, which is tied to European intellectual circles, trying to say, should Jews have an identity that's only distinct to them? Should Jews be viewed as a group that should live insular? Or should Jews be subjected to different laws and discrimination? Should Jews be moving to Israel and the establishment of Zionism? All of that pertained to the Jewish question, which was a topic that people wrote about. There was also an Armenian question about Armenian identity and establishment of an Armenian state, and the view and the false ideas about Armenian people as being subversive to the Ottoman Empire. And the Jewish question, or the Armenian question, if used in a hostile, in a discriminatory, derogatory, and stereotypical way, is pseudo-intellectual, and then it becomes this backwater of anti-Semitism, anti-Armenian. So understanding the larger implication of stereotyping is very dangerous. So the fear of Armenians as wanting their own revolution as being subversive is tied to a greater fear that causes the genocide. So in 1878, there was the Treaty of Berlin and the rise of the Armenian question. European powers, particularly Britain and Russia, pushed for reforms in Armenian-populated provinces. Ottoman officials began seeing Armenian political activism, specifically calls for autonomy, as foreign, instigated, and subversive. No direct communist accusations were developed yet, but the idea of Armenians as being agents of foreign destabilization began here in 1878 onwards. So in 1887 was the formation of the Social Democratic Hukanhayan Party in Geneva, the first Armenian Socialist Revolutionary Party. So they advocated for social reforms and the rights of Armenians, and the eventual independence using socialist rhetoric. so seen by the Ottoman state as both separatist and socialist, and therefore potentially dangerous because it was active in diaspora centers like Cairo, Paris, and Geneva, and had a clandestine network inside the empire. 1890. Formation of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, ARF. So initially more nationalists and socialists later adopted more moderate policies needs to be taken into account. And so painting them as fringe when they're not is again something that is suspect. Armenians sought reform within the Ottoman Empire's system. Moving forward, we're focusing on the Armenian massacre, in which up to 300,000 Armenians were killed under the Sultan Abdul Haman II. They justified partly on the basis of Armenian revolutionary activity, though the majority of the Armenian population was unarmed and non-political. The first widespread use of the revolutionary threat was seen in the language circulated around the Armenian massacre. Moving forward, talking again about the Russian Revolution of 1905, before the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Ottoman Empire feared that such revolutionary activity could happen, and that such socialist and revolutionary ideas would spread across the border. Armenians living in Russia controlled Caucasus, especially Baku, were heavily involved in Marxist and revolutionary networks. Ottoman elite started to conflate Armenian ethnicity and revolutionary ideology, particularly Marxism and Bolshevism, with Armenians. So, beginning in 1905, you start to see the false using of Marxism and Bolshevism against Armenians. When the Young Turk Revolution broke out in 1908, the constitution restored Armenian parties, particularly the ARF, greatly allied with the Committee of Union and Progress. So the Young Turk Revolution was a good thing in the beginning because it was very pluralistic. Armenians, Circassians, Turks, Greeks were all represented by the Young Turks because it supported a secular, free society. The split emerged after the 1909 Adana massacres and the 1912 to 1913 Balkan Wars. After 1913, the CUP became increasingly xenophobic, nationalistic, and paranoid, especially towards Armenians. 1914 to 1914, prelude to the genocide. So, the prelude to the genocide implicates the CUP military uprising in Russia, Armenia, causing a major rupture. The Ottoman propaganda escalates, claims that Armenians are colliding with Russia, claims that Armenians are forming revolutionary cells, claims that Armenians are planning insurrection in eastern Anatolia. So these claims are now being used as a cultivation for collective punishment. The CUP frames the Armenian population as a fifth column, aligning with Russian imperialists and socialist revolutionaries. Key political justifications for the genocide. Armenians are not loyal, but are part of a broader communist socialist conspiracy with foreign enemies, such as Russia and France, threatening the survival of the empire. So these are dangerous, loaded accusations. So I know this video has gone pretty long, so I'll try to end it soon. So I'm trying to show important history that needs to be talked about. On April 24th, 1915, Armenian intellectuals were arrested in Constantinople. So the 200 Armenian cultural and political leaders that were rounded up, deported, and executed, among them were journalists, doctors, teachers, and politicians, some with socialist or revolutionary affiliations, but also many were apolitical. This act was the initiation of the broader Armenian genocide. In 1915 to 1917, the genocides and accusations intensified throughout the empire. Armenians were accused by officials within the CUP press, known as Tanin, as Armenian bands of anarchists and socialist revolutionaries collaborating with the Russian army. So I'm going to end the video there because I want to focus more on the post-1917 era in a separate video to show the extent to which the telegraph radio system was deployed within the Armenian genocide. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. That's over 30 minutes long. Sorry about my voice in some parts. But have a great day, and I hope to do another video soon. Thank you.